Hey all, welcome to Circle of Tone, and today we have Killing Joke. Geordie Walker is the man. The reason I'm holding this right now, this is a real 1959 Gibson, was it ES125T? And I bought this because of Killing Joke. When I saw that in the 80s video and the tone he was getting, I thought I had to have one. I ended up going up I-95, which is a major highway in Florida, driving for hours to find the man who owned this guitar to trade a bunch of gear with him. Ended up trading with a sailor with one leg. Ended up being a really cool guy, but it's like the weird adventures you get on when you are seeking gear. Yeah, so this is it. This did me proud. And I know what you're thinking, but Owen, this doesn't have a bridge pickup like Geordie's, but he actually uses his neck and his middle pickup, his middle position, for most of his rhythms, and for obviously for the chugging and solos, things like that. He used to switch to his treble pickup. So a lot of the old tones that you had, case in point, the old videos I've done in the past with Black Sabbath, that's all neck pickup. And the last one I did, the Damned, that was neck pickup. A lot of the classic tones, modern forums have told us to get the best tone you need the rhythm pickup and all the blah blah blah. All the old classics, most of them were neck pickup, because the old, if you see the old Les Pauls, used to have rhythm was actually on the neck. It's literally said so, rhythm. And then you go to treble and it cuts through for solos. So that's a little tip. But let's get to the gear. So Geordie Walker, unobtainium. You might notice that, my tone didn't really sound right. And that's because the amps that you used back in the past were old Berman amplifiers. And these things were things of beauty. On Tony Mackenzie's, go and check him out. He's a old school British, very meticulous YouTuber, cool channel. I've been subbed for years. He opened up one of these and it had old, people thought they were partridge transformers. I don't think they were. I think they're actually custom made just for these Bermans. If you've seen old videos of me as well about the good stuff, the old mullered capacitors, but mustard capacitors, as a lot of the amplifier community call them, they were full of the good stuff. And they were early on, I think there's a rumor, I'm not sure if this is true, but apparently they have like 3 triple cascading gain stages on these old amps. And apparently Mesa Boogie copied it. And they used to call these things the Mesa Boogie Killer. The reason I can't recreate this as well is because he used 10-inch speakers. And not just 10-inch speakers, we're talking 8x10 stereo, 16 speakers, blasting through these massive, ridiculously loud dual Berman heads. And how did he spread that sound? He actually used an old Memory Man pedal, which has the stereo outputs. So he'd go from the stereo outputs of that, which into 2 Bell ADT. They're kind of like choruses. They call them ADT, automatic double tracker, I think they are. So yeah, so Geordie used the stereo Bermans, 8x10 cabs on each side, through these weird. Listen to how sexy this name is. When you have nerds making this early equipment with time delays and the bucket brigade. Bucket brigade. Listen to the name of this company. This tickled me. It really rolls off the tongue. Parmi Acoustics and Collins. I can't even fucking say it. Parmi Acoustics and Collins Electromagnetics. Oh, I wonder why my company didn't take off. Jesus Christ. So yeah, and I'll go on to gear that he used later on. Like he went on to use Dragons and he went on to use all sorts of stuff. But that'll be in the description. And his love affair started with Gibson. And this is why everybody in the underground knows all roads lead back to Engelbert Humperdinck. For you young fans out there, that's a real person, that's a real artist, and he was massive in the past. But what happened was Geordie Walker's mother went to see Engelbert Humperdinck, and apparently on the same bill was a young man called, what's his name? I don't know, James Hendrix or something like that. So she saw Jimi Hendrix, housewife, looking for something, melodic and the rest of it. And she ended up getting her mind blown by Hendrix. And as soon as she saw Hendrix, she kind of got obsessed a little bit. That guitar gene got inside her. So when little Geordie Walker wanted to learn how to play guitar, she took him to a music store and basically pointed at one of the most expensive guitars on the rack, which is an old Gibson. I think it was a custom Gibson Les Paul. His father was behind him and he was going pale because he saw the price on those old Gibsons. There's a lot of money back in the day. One of his first guitars was one of the best guitars you can buy. But he didn't get his famous gold hollow body Gibson. His famous one was an early 50s ES, was it 225 Gibson, the gold one? It was kind of gold and green by the time, he was famous for using it because, they age a certain way. So he fell in love with that. Think about, right? This thing is so resonant. I can keep hearing my voice making the strings ring. So you think about the UK back then, all right? Grey and dismal. In the 70s, it was black and white TV. It was coal mines. It was miners' strikes. It was miserable, man. But then all of a sudden, you started getting colour TV. And all of a sudden, you started getting colour brochures. So Geordie now would be in this like black and white land. And he'd opened up this beautiful colour Gibson brochure and he saw the gold Gibson and he just fell in love with it. He said he had to have it. The influence this band had on industrial metal is they were practically one of the first. Search Circle of Tone in Facebook. Come and join our little group. But 8 months ago, I posted this radio station in the UK called Radio 1, and John Peel was the after hours indie, the bubbling underground scene. He would cover it, everything from Napalm Death to all sorts of shit that they would have his sessions. Yeah, so one of the earliest tracks, I actually posted Psych, which was from the sessions, and we're talking late 70s, and it was industrial metal. It was Chug. Do you know what influence they had after that? Ministry ended up taking their bass player. Yeah, that's not a coincidence. He ended up in Prong. The bass player ended up in Prong, the late, great Paul Raven. And I'll talk about him more after I cover the guitars. But that is another aspect of this band which goes unsung on bass forums, on guitar forums in general. Paul Raven. But I'll get to him later on. So let's get back to the gear. With Geordie, because it was acoustic as well, you had things called contact mics, piezo mics, things like basically pickups that you put inside acoustics. So he not only did he go through amps and the rest of it, he would also try and capture the resonance as well. Microphone wise, I actually know what they used. I contacted Chris Kimsey and he got back to me and I was so happy. So he actually told me that he used two U67s. These are the tube microphones. I'm actually talking through a tube mic right now, which is kind of a copy of those old ones. So two Neumann U67s, and he used two SM57s, and he also used one AKG stereo mic to capture the room as well. So very good to know. If you're interested in how I captured it, it's pretty funny. One of the most popular Instagram posts I ever did. I said I finally found a use for my Mesa Boogie Correcto. And it's basically holding up my amp as like a table. And what's funny is that somebody commented, ironically, Mesa is table in Spanish. So, it's my recto is doing its job, holding up better amps. So yeah, Geordie would go on to say, how critical miking is. And he spent endless hours just walking around the room, listening for the sweet spots, because we're so used to forum advice of closed miking, SM57 on a vintage 30 with a treble pickup, and then everybody lost interest in guitar. The actual people thinking from themselves and coming up with their own tones. Who else has gone through a stereo pair of Neumanns through 1610 speakers and vintage 50s Gibsons, and and then created something heavy. You know, it's food for thought, man. And another individual aspect of Geordie's playing was he never really did solos. A lot of them would be almost like Pete Townsend-ish, where they would be more like ringing chords and fascinating. I mean, the solo in Eighties is a perfect example of it. It's like a jangly, weird, swirling, just brilliance. I love it. And it's such an original band. I mean, to come out of post-punk to something that is still hard-hitting when it comes to social commentary and the rest of it, but it's so evocative. It just puts you in a space. Killing Joke were hated by the press. Everybody's saying, oh, they're devil worshippers, this, and you know, they're trouble and the rest of it. But it was just, there was something about that band, man. Just researching them, I constantly got my mind blown. There is a documentary that's going to be coming out streaming soon. It's only been available on DVD. They hooked me up. They actually give me a link to watch, which is great. You know, it had the timestamp on there. It wasn't an official one, but I'd already done a lot of research before I watched that. But the amount of times my mind has been blown by not just their music, but by their actual ethos. Let's talk about Jazz. Jazz, he is classically trained. I had no idea he could play the piano or play the violin as good as he could. He's fronted some of the best orchestras that's ever, you know, held a bow. Just starting the band, I mean, Geordie, it was the first band he ever joined. He responded to an advert in the Melody Maker back in the UK. He argued with Jazz the first day, and you'd come back away from that thinking, this guy's really passionate, and he made good points, you know, and things like that. So they from the start there was friction. Jazz and the drummer Big Paul, actually, they would do rituals. They were into the occult, they were into numerology, they were into all sorts of stuff. In fact, it was one of their rituals, they burnt down the apartment that they were staying in once. And at the time, Geordie was staying much like Syd Barrett in an old girl's like dormitory until they caught him, and then do you know what? He was kind of pretty angelic. He might have passed for a girl back then, apart from his big bluff Geordie accent, you know. Yeah, they'd fuck you up. That band would fuck you up, especially Paul Raven. Yeah, so Jazz is a force of nature. Some of the things that he said in these interviews that I looked at, things like, what is the traditional British rhythm, a traditional British beat? And he said that the church actually ruined a lot of the old musical ways, so that it kind of took away, so everybody started singing in a church. You know, there was no real accompaniment apart from an organ, you know, later on, and so it kind of like stomped out a lot of the old ways of, because there was, in all cultures there's usually very drum heavy, even from, you know, Native Americans to African to, but Britain didn't really have that until the 20s and marching bands. And he also gave a shout out to Wales, because our traditional past was the song, it wasn't the drums. Wales, if you didn't know, we are massive singers. It's part of the culture, our low culture. So that is part of the rhythm. They say that, you know, you can hear the choirs over the valleys, and that's something. I was in a choir. All kids were in choirs when they were kids in Wales. We have some of the Marsh and Orpheus was, I could literally walk there in 5 minutes. And Marsh and Orpheus are probably the most famous choir in the world. So our national rhythm is the voice, not the drum. But it's funny trying to find the English rhythms. It's weird, right? When you think about the tribal aspect, and that he's huge. Jazz is huge when it comes to tribalism and the old ways of forming music and traditions. And you got to hand it to him. He's even looked into the frequency of the earth. So there's certain there's frequencies to everything, and he's gone to ley lines. He's gone to Iceland. He just dropped his band. He didn't even, when they had their biggest hits and they were in France, he just got up and left in a huge height of their fame. He got up and left and went to Iceland without telling anybody. And then after a while, Geordie followed him, and the drummer was like, what the hell? He felt like an outsider then. He would get with weird people in Iceland and try and really dig in to the frequencies of these mystical places. He's recorded inside of one of the Great Pyramids. He actually managed to trace down the elders, the leaders, to convince them, because he's very convincing. He is a brilliant man. And he's actually recorded inside a fucking pyramid. Respect. I love it. I mean, what? Nobody talks about him because the press has hated him for so long. They've hated him. And speaking of press, the NME is the big one back in the UK. And they did something. They did a usual hit piece on him. And I think this was in the late 80s, I think. And he went there, and they actually knew. They kind of had like a security door where you had to get buzzed in and the rest of it. And they kind of knew he was on the warpath. So he went there, kind of like acted nice, to start with, and got his foot in the door. And once he was in there, he took out some liver, slapped it on the receptionist's table, and he was sprinkling maggots and liver all over the front desk of the NME. He's not... The Anarchy and punk rock, it's so overstated. I mean, Raven himself was probably the closest thing you'll get to an anarchist that ever, played bass. He ended up, when he died, he couldn't go back to the UK. I think he had multiple fake passports. He was a gangster. It's hard drinking, hard talking, one of the funniest guys apparently you can meet, but, don't mess with this band. I love them. It's just, they're so honest. They're so punk rock, even though they weren't, officially punk. They had that anarchy. They had the true anarchy, not just teasing their hair and putting a safety pin through their nose. They were anarchists, man. All right, so I'm holding the fat strings. So let's talk about Paul Raven. He used on this album, Trace Eliot amps and cabs. So I'm not sure if it was 10s or 15s. I actually hear both. So it's, I've seen a lot of live footage of him back in the mid-80s, and they'd have the 10s and the 15s. I hear the articulation of 10s, and I hear the oomph of 15s. So unless there was something direct going in there as well as the room mics and the cabs, I don't know. He had some power. And how young was he on that album, man? He looked like baby-faced. And they still had it. They still had that, he had that funk. And he died about, was it over 10 years ago? And there's a beautiful song that Killing Joke wrote about him. And it's just one of the nicest songs. I'll put that in the top comment. I'll pin it. And it's just so nice. It's the lyrics. It's so sad that he died. He was he's burning the candle, he's burning it in every direction, if you know what I mean. But that is part of the spirit of anarchy. You've got rules, personal responsibility. He was his own rule. He was his own castle. And that's what I love. And one of the things that gets Jazz and Raven and the Geordie and Big Paul running around the world was that there's an old quote. I'm going to butcher it, but it's something like, get your own island and fortify it. And he's been doing that with his music. He's been doing that literally, where he's bought places in New Zealand, and he's still got places in Iceland where he can bed down if the shit goes down, because he is. Think about it, right? When you're a young man in the 70s, there was nothing. The late 70s, there was nothing but the Cold War. Fucking pictures of mushroom clouds on the TV. You know, Russia. This, and now we're back to a Cold War, but it's a Cold War bullshit right now. What's going on? I mean, poor Tulsi Gabbard. That's all I can say. I'm not really on the left, but Tulsi is getting smeared right now with Russian propaganda. It's, you know, from the CIA, from Hillary. What the fuck is going on right now? So they're still saber rattling about these tensions that really don't exist. And this is a long conversation. Maybe I would love to have that conversation with Jazz. You know, he questions everything, and I like that in a person. You know, they don't just take the official line of 9/11, they don't take the official line on Russiagate, they don't take the official line on most aspects of religion, you know. So yeah, what a band. Man, I'm going on a rant. So respect to these guys, respect to this band. So that'll wrap it up for Goth Broth. I hope you liked it. This is my favourite time of year. Goth Broth is going to be a more regular thing than it was in the past. I mean, I did one, and then a year passed, I didn't do another. So I thought that Halloween would be a good time to do Goth Broth. And so if you have any suggestions of any Gothic bands, I know I've been doing the rockier stuff, because Killing Joke, you know, some of their songs are goth staples. But I've zoomed in on the rockier stuff. So in the future, I will be doing a little bit more of the sadder, clean guitars. You know, I've done The Cure in the past, things like that, but I have gone a little bit goth rock, so now it's time to go, you know, in another direction, I think. Because 80s is a banger. Oh, if you like the bass, you can get one of these in the link for about $70. This thing's amazing. And didn't set it up with nothing. Still has the same strings on it. This thing has done me proud. And also, if you want to see all of my mic positions, all of my settings, nothing really that you can recreate, because it's kind of crazy. I ended up using the JCM 800 and an old Fender Bassman for most of these tracks, for the guitar and the bass. So, and I also used an MXR delay, which I used for the chorus. I went a bit too crazy on it. But yeah, so it sounds out of tune. It's not out of tune. I just put too much of the modulation on there. And I also, because it had so many gain stages, you know, the 3 cascading gain stages, I put this in front of it as well, because I noticed that it has a lot of sizzle. 10-inch speakers will give you sizzle too in the distortion. If that was recorded to tape, you know, you get away with it. If you record that same setup that Geordie was using to digital, it would sound like fizz. So I used the closest thing I had to fizz, which is a Rocktron Piranha preamp. I used that on a Slipknot video, recreation video as well. That's the old, from Slipknot's debut album. That's the that's what they used on that for most of it, with 7. So alright chaps, and thanks to my patrons of Tone. Nobody signed up recently. It's what keeps my speakers flapping. So if you like these vids, give me a thumbs up. Share this to your goth friends, because that's what we do on the underground. So think of it as modern tape trading, where you just share, you know, musicians and websites, not just mine. Anybody you respect, share it, because that's the only way we're going to get traction. Get me out of the underground. I'm too pretty. I'm too pretty for the underground.